I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Trump Watch. One of the fascinating questions that no one seems to be asking is how is it that President Trump switched from being anti-war, anti-imperialist, anti-warmongering to initiating all of these military strikes and threats of military strikes and military conquests of people in different parts of the world. How'd that happen? He campaigned on this libertarian principle of non-interventionism. And now it's like there's a totally different person in office, as manifested by these killings of these people on the high seas in those little boats, and then this military strike in Venezuela that violently kidnaps the head of state there and kills in the process 100 people, and now threatening to bomb Iran for killing protesters over there, and threatening to conquer Greenland and steal that land from Denmark. Why? Well, Trump has never given an explanation as to this switch, and people haven't pressed him for an explanation, including his MAGA supporters. I mean, you would think that they'd want an explanation, but instead they have simply seamlessly gone with him and are now supporting all of this imperialism and militarism and killing. And remember what Martin Luther King said. Martin Luther King pointed out that this is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. He's talking about the federal government. This was in 1967. And nothing's changed. And we seem to see more of this killing machine under Trump. Why? Why did he switch over? Remember when he used to talk about draining the swamp and bringing an end to the deep state and so forth? You don't hear that anymore. At least you don't hear it very much. Why the switch? Well, we can only speculate. But what my hunch is, and this is just a hunch, it's just an opinion, it's just speculation, I don't have any evidence of it, but one possibility is that the national security establishment made him an offer he couldn't refuse. That is, told him that you're going to do this, you're going to come on board because we favor it. I mean, if you go back to the end of the Cold War racket, and that's what it was, it's a racket to keep the national security state, this governmental structure in existence that we now live under, but which our American ancestors didn't have to live under, a national security state form of governmental structure. It was a big racket. The Cold War was, the Reds are coming, the Communists are coming, the Cubans are coming, the North Koreans are coming. It was all to keep this structure and to convert America into a national security state, then keep it in existence, and tons of largesse, which Trump is now wanting to expand to $1.5 trillion, a budget for the national security establishment. But it was all a racket to keep them in existence. This racket entails stirring up things around the world and making Americans afraid, and that people are coming to get them, whether it's communists or terrorists or Muslims or drug dealers or illegal immigrants or whatever, so that people will turn to the national security state as their God. Oh, please keep us safe from the dangers that the national security establishment is producing. But when that Cold War ended, people were talking about a so-called peace dividend. This was like 1989. The Cold War had ended. The racket was over, much to the surprise of the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA. Nobody ever expected that to happen. And now people were saying, and inevitably people were going to be asking, why do we even need a national security state now? The reason America's federal government was changed to a national security state from a limited government republic was because of the Cold War racket. But once the racket ended in 89, people inevitably were going to ask that question. And the Pentagon and the CIA and the NSA knew it. And so they immediately said, we can fight the drug war. Don't get rid of us. Don't reduce our budget. We can fight the drug war. They were bringing that up back when the Cold War racketed. And now, as we all know, they never gave up hope of restoring Russia as an official Cold War enemy, and Cold War racket number 2. And there's always China and Cuba's. Cuba, duh. It's always been there as a communist dagger pointed at America's neck. Even though Cuba has never attacked the United States, never threatened to attack the United States. And so this, in my opinion, this whole Venezuela thing may very well have been engineered by the national security state. And they made Trump some kind of offer that he couldn't refuse. Like I say, no evidence, just speculation. But it seems to me a rational explanation for why a man would completely change his position. I mean, let's give him the benefit of the doubt and say he wasn't lying to the American people when he was running for office. He really was going to drain the swamp, and he really intended to take on the deep state like President Kennedy had. And I think it's possible that the national security state has engineered this whole thing, which they had planned to do back in 1989, as a way to make America afraid, but also make America proud again. You know, I mean, look, they've suffered huge defeats in Afghanistan, 20-year war based on lies, and they got booted out of the country. And then there's, of course, Vietnam, more lies. The Reds are coming to get us, and they got booted out of that country. And then Iraq's been a disaster. They installed a pro-Iranian regime there. I mean, they called it Operation Iraqi Freedom. How many Americans, including members of Congress and members of the military, go to Iraq today for vacation, summer vacation? Zero. Operation Iraqi Freedom. And so this Venezuela thing and these armed battles that they've engaged in, the U.S. Navy with these boats, these little tiny boats, defenseless boats, those are great victories. They're considered great military victories. I'm sure they're going to go down in the annals of U.S. naval history as great victories. They're probably already at the Naval Academy teaching how we took on these boats, which, by the way, the press is now reporting that part of their strategy was to win these battles that were sort of like, the Battle of the Pacific in World War II. That they use civilian airplanes or planes disguised as civilian planes. And, well, it turns out that's a war crime. That you can't do that. That you cannot disguise a military vessel, a military plane, as a civilian airliner prior to attacking these boat people. And so if you take the Trump administration's position that this is an active war, fog of war, there's a fog of war, when they double tapped that those two people that had survived the first attack on that boat, that this was just how war is, well, then that's a war crime. But of course, the irony is that they brought Maduro for trial over here in New York, and Maduro says, "Well, I'm a prisoner of war then." No, this is not a war. It's enforcement of a criminal statute related to drugs and guns and terrorism, which is a criminal offense. So they can't get their story straight on this whole thing. But again, why did Trump shift over? We don't know. But what we do know, that this thing's the strangest thing in the world. I mean, for years and years we've been hearing about the horrors of this Maduro regime. Massive violations of civil liberties, torture, indefinite detention of innocent people, killing of dissenters, illegitimate president that lost the election, but he's got his national security establishment because they have the same type of governmental system that we do here in the United States. They're a national security state. So as long as Maduro had the loyalty of the military, as Trump does with his military and CIA here, he was secure. He could start jailing dissenters. And it's so fascinating that the mainstream press for years has been condemning the Maduro regime and supporting sanctions that are designed to create suffering and economic privation and death among the citizenry, with the aim that the citizenry will say, well, gosh, we don't want this suffering. We want to live normal lives, so we're going to oust the regime. Sort of what's happening in Iran today. People are tired of the debasement of the currency at the hands of the government because they have the same type of monetary system that we do here in the United States. They're just printing money out the gazoo. And so the mainstream press was supporting all this, along with all the MAGA people and the Trumpsters and so forth. But now Trump has thrown them a curveball here, where he goes in there and his forces capture Maduro, but then leave the regime that everybody's condemned and rightly condemned in power. So you now have the U.S. government supporting this tyrannical regime, taking control of it, and expecting the levers of tyranny to operate in accordance with Trump, who says he's running the country, that he's the president effectively now of Venezuela, and he's expecting the interim president, Delcy Rodriguez, to follow his orders. And of course, all of this, a lot of it is oriented toward opening up the oil fields to American oil producers. And here's another fascinating aspect of this. Trump summons the executives of all the major oil companies to the White House to have a consultation. And they all go. I mean, and nobody asks any questions. This is all considered normal. Normal? Where the ruler of a country has the ability to summon the executives in the world of business industry, which is supposedly private, to come and meet with him. What business is it of the U.S. government to be ordering or summoning or inviting executives of these oil companies? Well, Trump says, well, I'm managing the show. I want you to invest, your hundreds of millions of dollars in Venezuela. They stole our oil. He said, they didn't steal our oil. That oil didn't belong to Trump. That oil didn't belong to the U.S. government. It always belonged to Venezuela. And it was they don't have the same kind of system that we do here, where private landowners own the mineral rights under their lands, unless they transfer the mineral rights to another owner, which they're entitled to do. You can have somebody owning the surface and somebody owning the minerals. In Venezuela, the government has always owned these natural resources, as they do in many other countries, Mexico, Saudi Arabia. And so what they would do is lease out the right to extract the oil, much as a private owner of mineral rights here in the United States will lease out to the oil company the right to take out oil, and they get a royalty and a bonus and so forth. So what happened is that the Chavista movement there just nationalized the whole operation and said, well, we're not going to honor these concessions anymore. That date back to like the turn of the century, and there's no telling, the terms of these leases were very favorable to American oil companies at the turn of the 20th century. So we don't know how exactly they got them. But in any event, this is the risks that a private oil company takes. I mean, they all know that. It's the same with gold mining companies, silver mining companies. You go into a foreign country, you take your chances. There's always that chance of nationalization. And they all know it happens. So they're just taking a risk, and they're hoping to make enough money during the first part of the lease so that if nationalization ever comes, okay, they've made enough money off it anyway. But so they lost a lot of money, and they got arbitration awards, and Venezuela owes them money. But this is all private stuff. What business does Trump have interfering with the oil-producing aspects of America's private sector? I mean, this is phenomenal. I mean, this is like the ruler, commanding people or inviting people to come, and I'm going to manage you. This is what you need to do. He's running the oil companies. I mean, he's running the oil industry, at least with respect to Venezuela. And nobody questions it. It's all like considered normal. And what's fascinating is that many people in the mainstream press have shifted gears too and said, well, this is a very wise move on the part of Donald Trump to leave this tyrannical socialist regime that we've been condemning, that we've been supporting sanctions against for umpteen years, whose regime is totally illegitimate and so forth. And exclaiming and glorifying the dissent, the opposition led by Marina Corina Machado, and that she's heroin and all this, and now Trump turned out to be right. He's right to be keeping this illegitimate socialist regime in power. for stability's sake. So here now you have the spectacle of the U.S. government supporting this tyrannical socialist regime that they still have sanctions against, as long as they follow orders of Trump. And you've got the mainstream press, not all of them, but many of them, shifting too. And my hunch is that they're not just supporting Trump, they're supporting the national security establishment. Remember Operation Mockingbird, where they had assets, the CIA had assets in the mainstream press, secret assets, to report on things favorable to the CIA. Nobody went to jail for that. Nobody even got fired. Nobody got fined. My conviction is Operation Mockingbird just went deeper, and they not only started acquiring assets over the last 50 years, but also assets in the reporting part of it, but also the editorial part, the publishing part. I mean, who's to know what the CIA is doing with their money on any level? It's all secret. But I find it very fascinating, very kind of funny too, how you're seeing these articles in the mainstream press saying this is such a wise move to be supporting this tyrannical regime, after they've been exclaiming for decades how important it is that they continue imposing sanctions on the Venezuelan people. I mean, this is why 8 million people fled the country, because of the economic chaos that not only the socialism was causing, but the sanctions were causing. The sanctions were working to produce economic misery. And 8 million people leave. Now sometimes there's humor in some of this horrific tragedy, and that is with respect to Maria Corina Machado, because I have no doubts, totally expected Trump, when she saw this armada building up in the Caribbean there off Venezuela, that her day is coming. I mean, she hasn't been elected, but she was ready to take over as president. And so she engages in all this sycophantic glorification of Trump, praising him and supporting the sanctions against her own people, because she's seeing this, this is the only way. Well, it's not the only way. Another way is she could have said, we oppose what's going on in Venezuela, but we also oppose the U.S. government interfering with it. Just leave it to us. We will deal with this. And in other words, she should have gone to that Nobel ceremony and said, Mr. Trump, butt out of my country. And in fact, my opinion is that the real hero that will emerge out of this whole thing in Venezuela will be the person that opposes the socialism, the tyranny, and also opposes U.S. interventionism in his country. That will be the genuine Simón Bolívar that can lead Venezuela out of this morass. But instead, Machado is there, praising Trump. What a great man. Thank you, Mr. President, for doing this violent military kidnapping of Maduro and taking him to New York. But darn well that she's got to be shocked. But she can't criticize Trump. That's what's so interesting, because that would reveal that she was in favor of this violent regime change operation, which she never said she was in favor of. Same with her supporters, including some libertarians. They were very quiet about this proposed regime change operation. They figured, okay, we don't want to come out publicly and call for a military regime change operation at the hands of the Pentagon, but we'll just stay quiet and let it happen. In other words, they didn't publicly condemn it. They didn't call out and say, butt out of Venezuelan affairs, Mr. Trump. No, they just decided to stay silent. And so did she. That way they're not put in the uncomfortable position of being called interventionists or imperialists or whatever. If it happens, it happens, in other words. Well, so they can't now say, President Trump, this is horrible that you're not putting Machado into power, because that would reveal their motives. Their secret motives, that they wanted a regime change operation. So she decides that she's going to come and visit President Trump. Now, I don't know what she's going to say, but I'm sure it's going to be glorification. But I'm sure she's also hoping that President Trump changes his mind and decides to put her into power once he meets her and realizes. I mean, Trump made this nasty remark. He says, "Oh, she doesn't have the respect of the Venezuelan people." Are you kidding me? She could win an election there with maybe not so high anymore, because I think she definitely, people have lost a lot of respect for her for this sycophantic treatment with respect to Trump. But one of the funniest darn things in this is that she had said, well, I want to, I feel like I want to share my Nobel Prize with President Trump. He deserves this and stuff. Here's the guy whose forces are killing people in these boats through military force, who's threatening, who's already bombed Iran, who used an assassination, state-sponsored assassination in his first term to assassinate an Iranian general, and who's threatening to take over Greenland by force, and who's done this military operation to violently kidnap the president of Venezuela. That's peace. You see, that's how we define peace now in the world, at least in the Nobel world. And so she says, oh, she's going to, as part of this, I'm sure it was just bluster that, oh, he deserves this. But Trump has said, oh, well, she's coming to visit me. I'm going to accept the Nobel Prize from her. Now, I am certain this is not what she was expecting. It was really funny, because what does she do now? I mean, that's pretty nice honor to have a Nobel Prize. I don't know if it's a statue or a plaque or whatever. And the Nobel Committee has made it clear that Nobel Prizes can't be transferred. But you see, they're talking about before the award. They have no control over after what happens after the award. What are they going to do, So does she bring the plaque or the certificate or whatever trophy, whatever it is, to the White House with her? And Trump's going to say, where's my Nobel Prize? And how does she back out now? She said she wanted to share it with him. Well, he's saying sharing means let me have it, at least for a period of time. So what's she going to do? I'm sure she doesn't want to give up this big honor to Trump, but she's kind of boxed herself in, which is really kind of funny. So in the meantime, Trump is threatening to bomb Iran because Iran's killing protesters as part of its tyrannical regime. And Trump is outraged about this, even while his ICE people are killing protesters here in the United States. I mean, go figure. And so Trump's saying, well, I'll impose more sanctions, or I'll bomb them, whatever. That's going to stop him from killing protesters. But what everybody forgets is that the U.S. government is responsible for this. The CIA, the regime change operation, the regime change mentality. See, they all go back to 1979, the Iranian Revolution. The Iranians revolted against the Shah of Iran, the leader of that country. Why? Which is really ironic, because some of the protesters here are saying, bring back the Shah, because the Shah's son is still alive. He's living in New York or something, and he's ready to come back. But what they don't know is that the Shah's tyranny was as bad, if not worse, than this Ayatollah tyranny. And this guy was a brute. No different from Maduro or any other, or the right-wing General Pinochet in Chile, right-wing dictators, or this guy in El Salvador. This guy was brutal, which is why they revolted. See, people can revolt. This is what Machado doesn't realize is, okay, there are times where you can't revolt as a practical matter, especially since they have gun control in Venezuela. But still, just leave it to your own country to decide how this is going to be done, when it's going to be done, what the cost will be. And that's what the Iranian people did. When they revolted against the Shah, they knew they were taking on the U.S. government. They knew they were taking on the CIA and possibly the Pentagon. And they knew the U.S. was opposed to that revolution. And so when the U.S. is now supporting this stuff, what they call freedom is just putting in another U.S. dictator like the Shah. Now, how'd the Shah get in office? Well, this is what a lot of Americans don't want to confront, because of the U.S. So the U.S. is responsible for this Ayatollah system today. The suppression, the tyranny under which Iranians are suffering was caused by the U.S. government. Because in 1953, the CIA destroyed Iran's experiment with democracy. By ousting the democratically elected prime minister of the country, Mohammad Mossadegh. So they oust him, and then they put in the Shah, which then leads to this violent revolution in '79. So sometimes the consequences of these regime change operations are not immediate. I mean, when they did it in Guatemala, they ousted the democratically elected president of the country, Jacobo Arbenz, the CIA did. It took a few years before the civil war there starts really getting ramped up, and it ends up lasting about 10 years and killed over 1 million people. As a direct result of what the CIA is responsible for those 1 million deaths. And guess why they ousted Mossadegh in '53? Oil. Because Mossadegh had done what Maduro and Chavez had done. That he nationalized the oil industry and British Petroleum, I forget what their name was back then, which essentially had this huge monopoly over oil concessions in Iran. They were furious, but they couldn't do anything about it. You know, they didn't have the power that Trump had to go in there and capture Mossadegh, bring him back and charge him with narco-terrorism or whatever other sham thing was. And so they got the CIA to assist them, said, hey, we need to get our oil back. Would you come in and give us a hand? And sure enough, the CIA goes in there and gives the British a hand. And as soon as the Shah's in, the British are back with their oil concessions and so forth. So it's all about oil. But what I'm saying is that these regime change operations proved to be very, very destructive. So that the Iranian people, after their revolution, they're not able to get their democratic system back that the CIA destroyed in '53. They get this Ayatollah system. And then that encourages the U.S. the Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA, the National Security Establishment, and the rest of the federal government to impose these brutal sanctions on Iran. And guess who's suffering from the sanctions? The Iranian people. That's what they're protesting about. The debasement of the currency there, because they have the same kind of monetary system that Venezuela does and the U.S. does. They start printing the money. And I mean, I feel really bad for the Iranian people, just like I feel bad for the Venezuelan people. I mean, they have paid the big price for U.S. interventionism. And so, you know, I think Americans need to do some real soul searching of what's going on here. I mean, again, you know, Martin Luther King said this is the greatest purveyor of violence. We don't know exactly how many people how many deaths the U.S. national security state is responsible for in the last, let's say, 70 years, but it's got to be number in the millions. I mean, somebody, I think it was Vance or Vice President Vance recently said America's number one. Well, I'm sure he wasn't referring to this, but number one in terms of killing people. There's no question that we're number one, but that's not anything to be proud of. And it also explains a lot about Russia's attitude about Ukraine. That when NATO was approaching Russia's borders, which they had promised not to do, when the whole Soviet Union came crashing down, the Berlin Wall came crashing down, Russia said, okay, we're going to dismantle the Soviet Union, we're going to get out of Eastern Europe. We don't want you to be bringing your NATO forces over, which includes Germany. And Germany, of course, had devastated Russia in the Second World War, and they promised we won't do that. Well, they broke their promise, and I don't think it was the diplomats. I think it was the Pentagon and the CIA that broke the promise and began absorbing all these Eastern European countries. And the mainstream press is, what are they worried about? What are they worried about? I mean, so what if Ukraine's part of NATO? America's a peace-loving nation. America would never attack Russia. They're being paranoid. Are you kidding me? This is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world that the Russians are talking about. That's what they're worried about, is having the greatest purveyor of violence right there on their border that is using military force to enter countries and capture and and kidnap and rendition leaders and threatening to bomb Iran and threatening to conquer Greenland and take it over and peace-loving nation. Give me a break. I mean, the Russians are absolutely right. And so when Ukraine is over here talking about we want security guarantees, and the U.S. government is part of a peace treaty, and the U.S. government is saying, oh, well, okay, well, let's talk about these security guarantees. Why would Russia go along with it? That's exactly what they don't want. They don't want this peace-loving nation here on Russia's border, whether it's through NATO or directly. I mean, it's like, duh. So in any event, lots going on here with the Trump administration, but none of it's good for America, despite what you read in the mainstream press, that this is all making America great again, all this militarism and death and destruction. It's destroying our country. The national debt's now, 38 trillion? Maybe still at 37 trillion. This and you see all the consequences here in this country. I mean, we're irrational killings, off-kilter killings, suicide rates, massive drug addiction, enough to justify the continuation of this decades-old failed and destructive drug war system. I mean, alcoholism. All these are reflections that things are not good in this country. And the reason they're not good is because of things right there in Washington, D.C. Various aspects of this federal government that should never have come into existence. I'm Jacob Hornberger. This is Trump Watch. Thank you for tuning in. Look forward to talking to y'all next week.